You are standing in a marble courtyard beneath a violet Roman dawn. The scent of wine still clings to the air, and the bodies of dancers sleep where they fell. A woman walks among them, her silk robe trailing like spilled blood. She steps over the cups, the limbs, the broken masks of pleasure. Her name is Messalina, Rome's most feared seductress. But once, she was a girl who blushed at the word love. Tonight, she is the Empire's whisper, its hunger, its disease. How did a young empress become a legend of lust and power, feared by men who ruled the world and executed by the husband she betrayed? The day smelled of roses and oil lamps. Rome shimmered under a jealous sun, and the marble steps of the Palatine Hill glowed white as a funeral shroud. Somewhere within the imperial palace, a girl stood still while her attendants pinned gold into her hair. She was 15, soft-voiced, wide-eyed, and trembling like a candle flame before the wind. Her name was Valeria Messalina. Born of noble blood, she had been raised to smile at destiny, never to question it. Today, that destiny stood in the form of a man old enough to be her father, Tiberius Claudius Caesar, uncle to the late Caligula, newly crowned Emperor of Rome. He was awkward, hesitant, a scholar more than a soldier. Yet in this world of marble and iron, power was its own seduction. The ceremony was no love story. It was a negotiation of lineage. Senators whispered of alliances, fortunes, and heirs, while musicians played soft melodies to drown the silence between the bride and groom. Messalina's mother squeezed her hand, smiling with the brittle joy of ambition. When the veil was lifted, Claudius's eyes met hers, curious, uncertain, almost kind. For a heartbeat she thought she saw a safe future, a husband who would protect her from the cruelty of men like Caligula, from the whims of Rome's monstrous games. As the vows were spoken, incense filled the air. The gods were called to witness a union that neither heart desired, and when Claudius placed the ring upon her finger, she smiled as she had been taught to, perfectly, politely, and silently. Outside, the crowd cheered for the emperor's new wife, but within her chest, a quiet realization stirred. She belonged to the Empire now, and the Empire never loved back. The palace was a world of its own, vast, glittering, and suffocating. Hallways lined with ivory and mosaic stretched endlessly, yet there was nowhere Messalina could go that wasn't watched. Servants bowed too deeply, eunuchs whispered too quietly, and every wall had an ear trained to the sound of scandal. Her chambers were drenched in luxury, silk sheets, bronze mirrors, perfumes imported from Arabia. But at night, the perfume turned stale, and the silence grew heavy. Claudius rarely visited her rooms. When he did, it was out of duty, not desire. He was kind but distant, a man lost in scrolls and governance. Messalina learned quickly that an empress could be surrounded by thousands and still die of loneliness. At banquets she played her part, the devoted wife, the gentle hostess. She laughed when required, poured wine for senators, and spoke softly of nothing. Yet her eyes often wandered across the room, toward men who looked at her not as a queen, but as a woman. Rome was a city of appetite. It whispered of pleasures hidden behind curtains, of games played after dusk. Women of power were expected to be ornaments, not players. But Messalina was young, curious, and dangerously aware of the heat that pulsed beneath the Empire's golden mask. When she walked through the gardens of the palace, she watched lovers among the laurels, servants, courtiers, strangers, free in their secrecy. She envied them. They had the one thing an empress could not afford, choice. Sometimes when the moonlight touched the marble fountains, she would imagine running, out of the palace, into the chaos of the city, to be no one, to belong to no one. But in Rome, even dreams were owned, and hers belonged to the emperor. It began with glances, a soldier at the gates who bowed too slowly, a poet who recited lines that felt too personal, a musician whose fingers lingered on the lyre strings while meeting her gaze. None dared approach her, yet the invisible tension fed her heart like forbidden wine. Claudius, wrapped in affairs of state, remained oblivious. He trusted her innocence, as all Rome did. But innocence in a place like this was a fragile thing, a fruit left in the sun too long. At one banquet, Messalina overheard two senators whisper about a noblewoman known for her secret gatherings. Nights of silk and sin, they called them, where rank vanished and pleasure ruled. The words burned in her ears. For the first time she wondered what it meant to be desired not for title but for touch. That night she looked into her bronze mirror and saw a stranger, a girl trapped behind jewels. Her reflection smiled at her, almost mockingly. Rome expected her to produce heirs. Claudius expected obedience. But beneath the surface something darker began to breathe, a hunger not just for passion, but for power. The court's men underestimated her, mistaking silence for submission. They didn't see the sharpness in her gaze, the slow study of every weakness around her. Messalina was learning how to charm, how to listen, how to make herself indispensable in a world where women were meant to disappear behind their husbands. When dawn broke over the Tiber the next morning, she stood by the window, watching the city wake. The temples, the markets, the slaves sweeping marble steps, all part of the same machine. And in that golden light, the girl who had once trembled before her wedding veil whispered a vow no priest had heard. If Rome would make her a prisoner, she would learn to rule her cage. Rome by night was not the city of gods and marble. It was a heartbeat of shadows, feverish, perfumed, and alive with sin. Messalina first heard of the secret gatherings through a whisper, a servant's slip of tongue, a senator's laughter too loud to be discreet. They called it the Garden of Shadows, a hidden world behind the walls of nobility, where every law was undone by candlelight. At first, she went only to see, curiosity disguised as boredom. Her maid, trembling with both fear and envy, slipped her a mask of gold leaves and a cloak dark enough to erase her rank. When she entered, no one bowed, no one cared. The scent of wine and sweat clung to the air. Bodies moved like water beneath silk. Senators who thundered about virtue in daylight now begged for mercy at the feet of courtesans. Wives who had sworn chastity now laughed as they shed their veils. Here, Rome's power was not in the Senate nor in the legions, but in the flesh. Messalina felt the shock of it, the rawness. For the first time she saw men stripped of armour and arrogance, pleading for what they commanded by day. She watched, silent, her pulse betraying her. Someone brushed her shoulder, a hand, gentle, questioning. She turned, and in that fleeting moment she realized something the palace had hidden from her. Desire was not her prison. It could be her weapon. When she left before dawn, the marble of her sandals kissed the floor like a promise. The Empress had found her new court, one ruled not by decree, but by hunger. The following weeks were a blur of silk and strategy. Messalina returned to the garden often, sometimes masked, sometimes not. Her presence became legend whispered through the corridors of power. The Empress walks among us, they murmured, and she smiles. She learned quickly that every man there wanted something: pleasure, advancement, forgiveness. And she gave them just enough of what they desired to keep them obedient. A smile could change a vote. A touch could rewrite a law. Claudius, buried in administration, saw only stability in his reign. He never suspected that his young wife was weaving her own empire beneath the sheets of Rome. Messalina began to gather names: senators, tribunes, wealthy merchants. Those who dared to cross her found their fortunes crumbling overnight. Those who pleased her found themselves promoted, their debts erased, their sons favoured by the emperor. But power, once tasted, demanded more. She began to host her own gatherings within the palace gardens, illuminated by torches and drenched in roses. She called them feasts of Eros, though the guests knew better. Behind the laughter and music lay a system of control. Pleasure was the chain, she was the hand that held it. And in the quiet after each night, when the laughter faded and the perfumes dulled, she would stand at her window overlooking the city. Rome glittered below, unaware that it was already hers. It was said that she once whispered to a trusted servant, "Men think they rule the world because they hold the sword, but I rule them because I hold their secrets." By then, she no longer sought love, only domination dressed in the shape of it. But in Rome, every secret is a blade waiting to be turned. The first betrayal came from a lover too proud to be silent. Gaius Appius, a young senator with ambitions far larger than his wit. He boasted of her favours in drunken company, claiming the empress whispered his name in the dark. Word travelled, as it always did. Messalina summoned him one evening to the same garden where he had first touched her hand. She was calm, almost kind. "You have a dangerous tongue," she told him softly, tracing his face with her fingers, and Rome listens too closely. The next morning his body was found floating in the Tiber, his mouth filled with petals. The message spread faster than rumour. To speak her name was to invite silence, but her power only deepened. Fear became her perfume. Men trembled at her glance, yet they could not stay away. Even the wives of Rome, once her critics, began to seek her favour, hoping to survive her storms. One night, as torches flickered in her private hall, she watched a gladiator dance for her amusement. His skin gleamed with oil, his chains clinking softly with every movement. Around him, noble women gasped, half in terror, half in fascination. Messalina sipped her wine, eyes fixed on the man's trembling form. With a nod she ordered the chains removed. He hesitated. Freedom felt like danger in her presence, and as the music swelled, she whispered to her companion, "Even the strongest men forget their strength when they kneel." It was not lust that drove her now. It was the intoxication of seeing the mighty brought low. The Empress of Rome had discovered her truest pleasure. Power disguised as passion. Outside, the Tiber flowed quietly beneath the moon. Inside, another empire, one unseen by Claudius or his Senate, was already thriving under her reign. But the higher she rose, the thinner the air became. The laughter grew louder, the eyes sharper, and behind every cup of wine a whisper waited to turn. And though Messalina could not yet hear it, her name was already being spoken in secret halls, not with desire, but with dread. By the 3rd year of Claudius's reign, the empire no longer belonged to the emperor. It belonged to his wife, Valeria Messalina, the girl who once stood silent in her wedding veil, now ruled Rome through whispers, caresses, and fear. Her beauty was no longer innocent, it was weaponized. Her smile, a verdict. In the Senate, men bowed lower when she entered the room, even though she was never meant to be there. Orders that should have come from Claudius often came instead from her lips, carried by trembling messengers who dared not speak her name aloud. They called her the Empress of Desire, but behind the curtain of indulgence was a master strategist. Messalina understood what Rome worshipped most, not the gods, but pleasure and power, and she made them indistinguishable. Her lovers were no longer mere entertainment. They were chess pieces. A general who shared her bed received funds for his campaign. A senator who kissed her ring found his enemies exiled. A merchant who satisfied her whims secured contracts that stretched across the empire. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's own imperial enforcers, learned to take orders whispered in her chambers rather than shouted from the throne. Claudius, ever trusting, saw only stability. He praised her kind heart, unaware that her kindness was measured in loyalty and lust. His letters to the Senate were often drafted by her hand, his decrees shaped by her influence. The city became intoxicated by her myth. Street poets sang of her beauty. Brothels whispered her name as if it were a prayer. But others, The moralists, the widowed wives, the priests, began to call her something darker, the corruption of Rome incarnate. From the Palatine Hill she would watch the city shimmer at sunset, her reflection framed in polished bronze, every flicker of a torch below, every cheer in the circus, every sigh in the night. It all belonged to her. She had become not just an empress, but an empire of one. There was a time when Messalina sought affection. Now she sought control, and control demanded hunger. Her nights grew longer, her pleasures more elaborate. The banquets turned into spectacles, fountains of wine, dancers veiled in gold, musicians playing until their fingers bled. Each event was a performance of dominance. Every laugh she gave, every lover she chose was an act of conquest. But beneath the jewels and the perfumes there was an emptiness she could not name. It sat deep within her, cold and constant. When the music faded and the guests withdrew, she would stare at her own reflection and ask, "What do they love, me or what I give them?" Power had become her lover, her poison, her only certainty. Those closest to her learned that she trusted no one. Not even herself. One servant described her as a woman who smiled at daggers and wept for mirrors. The more she controlled others, the more she feared being controlled, and so she tested her influence, pushing it further with each passing month. She replaced officials at whim, confiscated estates, and even had rivals' wives accused of adultery, a crime punishable by death, only to claim their jewels as her own. The palace became a hive of secrets. Messalina's attendants knew never to speak without permission. Visitors entered her chambers with gifts and left with trembling hands, unsure whether they had been favoured or condemned. To the outside world she was the goddess of Rome's desire, but inside her heart, the same voice that once whispered of escape now whispered of ruin. Still, she silenced it. She drowned it in music, laughter, and bodies. For what was an empress without her power? A ghost, perhaps. And Messalina refused to become one. One night, she stood before Claudius as he praised her for her loyalty. He looked upon her with old, tender eyes, calling her my anchor in this storm of politics. She smiled, and for a brief second pity flickered across her face. Not for him, but for herself. She had long since become the storm, but storms, no matter how glorious, always leave wreckage. The Senate began to murmur. The generals grew restless. Even the Praetorian Guard, who had once obeyed her without question, started to shift uneasily beneath her shadow. Whispers began to rise, quiet at first, then sharper, like the hiss of a blade being unsheathed. "They say the Empress rules Rome while the Emperor sleeps," one senator dared to say. "If that is true, then who wears the crown?" Her enemies multiplied faster than her lovers. Some plotted in silence, others courted Claudius's advisers, planting seeds of suspicion. But Messalina was not blind to the danger. She began to sense the coldness in the corridors, the way conversations stopped when she entered, the way her servants avoided her gaze, so she struck first. A tribune accused of defiance was executed without trial. A nobleman rumoured to mock her was found dead in her villa, poisoned wine beside her bed. Rome trembled again, but this time not with lust, with fear. Yet even fear could not silence the one force that always outlasted empire's envy. Some claimed she was building her own faction within the court, a kingdom within the kingdom. Others whispered she sought to marry her lover Gaius Silius and make him emperor beside her. At first Claudius laughed at the rumours. "My Messalina?" he said. "She is as faithful as Rome itself." But faith, like marble, cracks unseen before it breaks. In the garden where her rise had begun, she now felt a strange chill beneath the roses. The same air that once smelled of wine and victory now tasted of decay. She could feel the eyes watching her, loyalists turning doubtful, lovers growing cautious. The empire that had once knelt at her feet was beginning to whisper prayers not for her favour, but for her fall, and though she would never admit it aloud some nights, when the torches flickered low and even the guards dared not look her way, Messalina could hear the faint echo of her own name carried through the dark, not as praise, but as prophecy. Messalina will destroy herself. She smiled into the silence, defiant still. If Rome demanded her ruin, she would give it. Beautifully. It began like all dangerous things do, quietly. Gaius Silius was no ordinary man. He was young, handsome, and carved from the same marble Rome used for its gods. When he first entered the palace, it was as a senator of rising influence. Known for his eloquence and discipline, Messalina noticed him immediately. The way light seemed to follow his steps, the way the others hushed when he spoke. In a city of decaying morals and tired lovers, he was something rare, untouched. At first she toyed with him, as she did with all men, a challenge, a game. But Silius did not bend easily. He resisted her advances with respectful distance, claiming loyalty to Claudius. That resistance lit a fire in her unlike any she had felt before. She began to crave him, not as another conquest, but as an equal. When they finally met in secret beneath the cypress trees of her private garden, the air was heavy with forbidden hunger. He trembled when she touched him. She trembled when he said her name. In that moment, the Empress and the Senator were not rulers and subjects. They were two souls daring the gods to strike them down. Soon, their encounters became constant. Days blurred into nights, whispers into vows. Silius was ambitious, yes, but he loved the danger of her more than her crown. He would have followed her into ruin, and she, blinded by passion, began to see him not just as a lover, but as her destiny. Rome's empress had found something more intoxicating than power, someone willing to share it. But love in Rome was never private. Every caress left a witness. Every secret carried a price. And already those loyal to Claudius began to sense that the Empress's heart, and perhaps her loyalty, belonged elsewhere. The affair might have remained rumour, if not for what came next. Silius, emboldened by her devotion, began to whisper impossible dreams. "Claudius is weak," he told her. "The people adore you. The Senate fears you. Why not rule openly? Together?" It was madness. But to Messalina it sounded like salvation. She had long grown weary of being the shadow behind the throne. For years, she had manipulated the empire through others. Now she longed to hold it outright, to be more than a whispered name in dark corridors. So when Silius proposed the unthinkable, a marriage, sacred and binding, she did not laugh. She said yes. The ceremony was arranged in secret under the guise of a private celebration. It was autumn in Rome. The air was ripe with harvest and decay. Under garlands of ivy and roses, Messalina arrived veiled in gold, surrounded by her closest confidants, those too loyal or too terrified to refuse her. The priest, bribed into silence, recited the rites meant for mortal lovers, and there, in broad daylight, while still the wife of Emperor Claudius, the Empress of Rome became the bride of another man. The crowd of guests, senators, generals, courtiers, laughed and drank as if part of a theatrical farce. Some believed it a parody, others a drunken jest. But Messalina's eyes never wavered. She believed it. She wanted to. For a brief blinding moment she felt untouchable. They say she danced barefoot after the ceremony, hair unbound, shouting, "I am finally free!" But freedom in Rome was a dangerous illusion, and in her joy she forgot that no secret stays buried in the city that fed on scandal. Within days the whispers reached the ears of Claudius's advisers, and then inevitably his. The emperor, away in Ostia inspecting fortifications, laughed at first. "A rumour," he said. "My Messalina would never." But when he saw the written testimonies, the names of senators who had attended the wedding, and the seal of the priest himself, the laughter died. The betrayal was too monstrous to comprehend. The Empress had not merely dishonoured him, she had mocked the gods, the throne, and the empire itself. The order was clear: return to Rome. When the gates of the palace opened that morning, Messalina sensed the air had changed. Her servants avoided her eyes. Her lovers vanished into the shadows. Then came the sound. Armoured footsteps echoing through the marble halls, the Praetorian Guard. She knew instantly. Panic clawed through her chest as she fled to her garden, the one place that had always felt hers. The same cypress trees that had sheltered her passion now seemed to whisper accusations. She sent word to Claudius, pleading, begging for mercy. But it was too late. The Senate had already convened. The city buzzed with disbelief and delight. Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, had turned her scandal into a feast. As she waited in the garden, word reached her. Silius had been arrested, and before sunset, executed. His body, once the altar of her desire, lay broken in the courtyard of the guard. Messalina collapsed. The Empress of Rome, who had toyed with senators and emperors alike, now wept like a child among the roses, yet even then she could not accept defeat. "Let me see Claudius," she begged. "If he sees my face, he'll forgive me." Perhaps for a fleeting instant Claudius might have. His heart had always been softer than his crown. But his advisers, Narcissus chief among them, knew mercy could mean ruin, so they gave the order she feared most. The guards approached as the sun began to sink. The garden glowed red with dusk. Messalina's hands shook as they handed her a dagger, whispering, "End it yourself. Die with dignity." She tried, once, twice, but could not bring herself to strike. The same courage that had defied an empire now abandoned her. At last a soldier stepped forward and finished what she could not. When Claudius received the message of her death, he said only, "Then let her be forgotten." But Rome did not forget. The woman who once ruled through desire was now a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting every marble hall she once commanded. Her name, once spoken in whispers of lust, would now be uttered in judgment: Messalina, the empress who dared to love too loudly and lost everything to the echo. The palace that once echoed with her laughter now lay in stillness. Messalina was no longer the pulse of Rome. She was its scandal, its whispered shame. When the Praetorian Guard stormed the palace, her world collapsed in a matter of heartbeats. Jewels clattered to the marble floor as servants fled, terrified to be seen in her company. The corridors that once bowed to her presence now recoiled in silence. She had ruled men through desire and deception, but now every face turned away. The Empress was untouchable, not in glory but in disgrace. Dragged from her chambers, stripped of her finery, she was taken to the gardens of Lucullus, the same gardens where she had once thrown her most decadent feasts, but now they were to be her prison. The roses that had been her emblems of beauty had withered. The fountains that once sang with music now whispered like mourning voices. There, surrounded by the ghost of her former splendour, Messalina waited for judgment, for mercy, for anything that resembled the world she had lost. Meanwhile, in the Senate, fury erupted like a storm. The senators, humiliated by her manipulation and enraged by her audacity, demanded justice. "An empress who weds another man while her husband lives," they thundered, "has waged war upon Rome itself." Claudius, still in shock, could barely comprehend it all. He sat motionless, clutching a letter from Narcissus, his most trusted freedman, describing every detail: the wedding, the witnesses, the proof undeniable. He muttered, almost to himself, "Bring her to me, let her speak." But Narcissus saw what Claudius could not. He saw an emperor too soft, too wounded, a man who might forgive, and forgiveness, he knew, would destroy what little authority Claudius had left. And so, as Claudius hesitated, Others acted. Messalina's fate was no longer in her husband's trembling hands. It was in the grip of those who had long waited for her fall. The palace that once echoed with her laughter now lay in stillness. Messalina was no longer the pulse of Rome. She was its scandal, its whispered shame. When the Praetorian Guard stormed the palace, her world collapsed in a matter of heartbeats. Jewels clattered to the marble floor as servants fled, terrified to be seen in her company. The corridors that once bowed to her presence now recoiled in silence. She had ruled men through desire and deception, but now every face turned away. The Empress was untouchable, not in glory but in disgrace. Dragged from her chambers, stripped of her finery, she was taken to the gardens of Lucullus, the same gardens where she had once thrown her most decadent feasts, but now they were to be her prison. The roses that had been her emblems of beauty had withered. The fountains that once sang with music now whispered like mourning voices. There, surrounded by the ghost of her former splendour, Messalina waited for judgment, for mercy, for anything that resembled the world she had lost. Meanwhile, in the Senate, fury erupted like a storm. The senators, humiliated by her manipulation and enraged by her audacity, demanded justice. An empress who weds another man while her husband lives, they thundered, has waged war upon Rome itself. Claudius, still in shock, could barely comprehend it all. He sat motionless, clutching a letter from Narcissus, his most trusted freedman, describing every detail. The wedding, the witnesses, the proof undeniable. He muttered, almost to himself, "Bring her to me, let her speak." But Narcissus saw what Claudius could not. He saw an emperor too soft, too wounded, a man who might forgive, and forgiveness, he knew, would destroy what little authority Claudius had left. And so, as Claudius hesitated, others acted. Messalina's fate was no longer in her husband's trembling hands. It was in the grip of those who had long waited for her fall. The night deepened. A thin wind rustled through the cypress trees, carrying with it the scent of dying roses. The guards waited in silence, their torches flickering like faint stars. Narcissus stood apart, his jaw clenched, not out of hatred but necessity. Rome demanded an ending, and someone had to deliver it. Messalina sat among the ruins of her garden, clutching the dagger against her chest. Her pulse raced. She pressed the blade against her skin, but her courage failed her. She had always been fearless in the face of others, but in the face of herself she was defenceless. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Tell him," she gasped, looking to Narcissus. "Tell Claudius I loved him once. Tell him I didn't mean for it to end like this." Narcissus said nothing. His silence was the answer. When she hesitated again, one of the soldiers stepped forward. There was no cruelty in his eyes, only duty, a single strike, swift, merciful. The Empress of Rome fell forward, her body collapsing into the grass, her blood mingling with the petals of the roses she once adored. The garden, once alive with music and lust, now stood still. At that same moment, far away in the palace, Claudius lifted his wine cup and asked almost absent-mindedly, "Is Messalina at dinner yet?" When Narcissus returned with the news, he bowed low and said, "She is dead." Claudius paused. The room was silent. He nodded slowly and whispered, "Then let her be forgotten." But Rome did not forget. Messalina became a ghost in the empire's conscience, a name whispered with both horror and fascination. The woman who had conquered hearts, toppled men, and challenged the throne itself, only to meet the quietest, most human end of all, not in fire, not in glory, but in the stillness of her own garden, where power faded, beauty wept, and the Empress finally feared the silence she once ruled. They say Rome was built on power, but power, like love, is never clean. In the beginning she was just a girl, draped in silk and innocence, handed to an emperor she barely knew. a pawn in the Empire's game. Yet within that fragile frame burned a hunger Rome could not contain. Messalina sought freedom where there was none, in the arms of lovers, in the illusion of control, in the fleeting thrill of being seen. But every kiss she stole was another chain tightened around her soul. The palace had promised her eternity. Instead it gave her a mirror, one that showed not a goddess, but a woman consumed by the very desires she thought she mastered. When the gardens fell silent, and her name became a curse whispered under torchlight, Rome learned a truth it would never admit, that its empire was as corrupt as the heart it condemned centuries later. Her story remains, not as a warning, but as a reflection. Because every age has its Messalina, every throne its gilded cage, and every woman who dares to want more than obedience walks the same narrow path between desire and destruction. So when you hear her name again, don't think of sin. Think of the silence after the feast, the moment when even power trembles. The wickedness of Messalina, Rome said, but perhaps it was only Rome's own reflection.